Hello, book lovers. Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is our ninth session of the guided reading of Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. We're more or less halfway through this project, and I've been really enjoying these live sessions to talk to you guys about Jane Austen's first published novel, to know about your responses, your opinions, your experiences reading the novel. So, this has been great. I hope you've been enjoying these sessions as well. Um, what is new is that now you can also listen to these discussions on the podcast and overview of English literature. So if you cannot make it live to be here on YouTube, and if you don't have the time to watch the video recording later, you can also listen to the discussion via the podcast. I hope you like that, those news as well. Excellent. So before we begin, I would like to remind you that if you would like to know more about Jane Austen's world, her relationship with her family, the world in which she lived and published her novels, the Regency era, her early writings, her juvenilia, her published novels, her unfinished works, her letters, the critical response to her work, the cult of Jane Austen, and so much more. If you're interested in learning more about Jane Austen's writing career, I would recommend that you follow the online course, the Jane Austen Club, which is now available at Books and Culture. You can access the enrollment page on the website, booksandculture.club, and you can also find more information about the course there. Excellent. So today we're going to be talking about chapters 30, 31, 32, and 33. So we're currently in volume 2 of Austen's Sense and Sensibility. But before we move forward with the story, let's take a step back and refresh our memories regarding what happened, what we read about last time. So we read about Marianne and Eleanor going to London with Mrs. Jennings, the beginning of a new adventure in their lives. We read about how Marianne writes a note to Willoughby and is anxious to get a response. Every day she's looking out the window. She is alert to any noises, any raps on the door, any visitors coming in. But nothing arrives. Nothing has arrived yet. And Eleanor becomes more and more suspicious. She wants proof of their engagement, right? So remember, Marianne never said anything about an official engagement, but their attitudes, the way that Marianne and Willoughby acted together, and the way they demonstrated their affection for one another in public meant a lot at that time. But Eleanor still wanted confirmation. Eleanor is the pragmatic one. She needs proof. They receive visits from Colonel Brandon and Mrs. Palmer in London, and Eleanor is watchful of Marianne's behavior. Willoughby leaves a card at Mrs. Jennings' house, but sends no letter nor visits again. So it is polite. Remember, we talked about this social protocols of the time. So whenever you arrived at a new place, so the Mrs. Jennings arrives in London. So in order for her to make her social circle of friends know that she is there, that she has arrived, she leaves a card, a visiting card at the address of everyone. That is the polite thing to do. So Willoughby does that. So to acknowledge the fact that he knows that Mrs. Jennings and the Dashwoods are in London, he sends them his visit card. But he never comes to visit, and he never answers Marianne's notes. The Middletons are also in the city. Everyone's moving to the city because the hunting season is over. So there's no one else fashionable, no one fashionable left in the countryside. They're all in London because the season has started. So Sir John and Lady Middleton are also in town, and they offer a small ball to their acquaintances. And Willoughby was also invited, but he didn't show up. And that really hurt Marianne because that was a chance in which they could see each other face to face and talk, right? After so many weeks of separation, but he does not show up. Marianne is hurt, restless, spiritless. Even the narrative is quite silent of her point of view, which is quite interesting. Remember how Jane Austen jumps from one character's perspective to another? She changes focalization. And up until this point in the narrative, we've read quite a lot through Marianne's point of view. But now that she cannot concentrate in anything else, she can only think about being abandoned by Willoughby. She has no energy. She doesn't want to sing. She doesn't want to play. She doesn't want to go outside. Her voice is also quiet in the narrative. And that is very, very interesting. Very smart of Jane Austen to do. Colonel Brandon is always visiting, and he says to Eleanor that Marianne's and Willoughby's engagement is widely known in the city, and he's very melancholy. Eleanor realizes then that Colonel Brandon indeed has feelings for Marianne, and she feels very sorry for him to see him like that, so melancholy. And the climax of last time, let's say, the Dashwood sisters attended a dinner party with Lady Middleton. And there was Willoughby. But he was accompanied by a fashionable young lady. And Willoughby was extremely cold with Marianne and Eleanor, especially with Marianne. And Marianne cannot understand this sudden change of behavior. And she's wretched. She's completely wretched. She's hurt. And Eleanor, sensible Eleanor, tries to rationalize the situation. That's what she always does. But she cannot really come to a conclusion. And the final chapter that we read, it was a gloomy morning. And remember when the landscape mirrors characters' emotions, emotional landscape, I call it. So the morning was gloomy. It was a January morning, so it was cold. That weather reflecting Marianne's wretched mood. And on that morning, she receives a cold letter from Willoughby. And he returns all the letters she had sent him and her lock of hair. So that was the final blow. He was super polite, but a politeness that hurts because he was being too formal with Marianne. And based on their kind of previous relationship, they were already very informal to each other. So being extremely formal meant a lot. He wanted to keep distance. And Marianne then is beyond wretched. And Eleanor is concerned with the impropriety of Marianne's behavior to Willoughby, since she finally finds out that there was no formal engagement between them after all. So in theory, Willoughby is not breaking any promises because he made none verbally. But by the way he acted, and the way he acted in public, everyone was expecting a relationship between Marianne and Willoughby. So theoretically, he didn't do anything wrong, but he hurt Marianne so much. And Eleanor suffers with her sister. And that is a very, very warm, heartwarming moment in the novel in which the two sisters have this time together. And Eleanor hears Marianne. Marianne is open for the first time. And they cry together, they suffer together. And that's where we left the narrative last time. So today we're going to be reading and talking about chapters 30, 31, 32, and 33. Chapter 30 is actually chapter 8 in volume 2. So let's get started. Mrs. Jennings came immediately to their room on her return, and without waiting to have her request of admittance answered, opened the door and walked in with a look of real concern. "How do you do, my dear?" said she in a voice of great compassion to Marianne, who turned away her face without attempting to answer. "How is she, Miss Dashwood? Poor thing, she looks very bad. No wonder. Ay, it is but too true. He is to be married very soon. A good for nothing fellow. I have no patience with him. Mrs. Taylor told me of it half an hour ago, and she was told by a particular friend of Miss Grey herself, else I am sure I should not have believed it, and I was almost ready to sink as it was." So Mrs. Jennings already knows that Mr. Willoughby is to marry um, so-called Miss Grey. So you see how gossip spread like wildfire in Regency England. So just a half an hour ago, she heard it from Mrs. Taylor, who had heard it from a particular friend of Miss Grey herself. So gossip about Willoughby's impending marriage, it's common knowledge. Well, said I, Mrs. Jennings continues. Well, said I, all I can say is that if it is true, he has used a young lady of my acquaintance abominably ill, and I wish with all my soul his wife may plague his heart out. And so I shall always say, my dear, you may depend on it. I have no notion of men's going on in this way. And if ever I meet him again, I will give him such a dressing as he has not had this many a day. But there is one comfort, my dear Miss Marianne. He is not the only young man in the world worth having, and with your pretty face you will never want admirers. Well, poor thing, I won't disturb her any longer, for she had better have her cry out at once and have done with it. The Parrys and Sandersons luckily are coming tonight, you know, and that will amuse her. She then went away, walking on tiptoe out of the room, as if she supposed her young friend's affliction could be increased by noise. The narrator's comments are the best. Marianne, to the surprise of her sister, determined on dining with them. Eleanor even advised her against it. But no, she would go down. She could bear it very well, and the bustle about her would be less. Eleanor, pleased to have her governed for a moment by such a motive, though believing it hardly possible that she could sit out the dinner, said no more. And adjusting her dress for her as well as she could, while Marianne still remained on the bed, was ready to assist her into the dining room as soon as they were summoned to it. So see the effort that Marianne is doing here. She is exerting herself. Remember, that is the word that Eleanor used in a previous conversation. And that was a word that was used at the time to refer to the power of the mind over the passions of the body, right? Exertion. So to use your to use your mind, the power of your brain, rational thinking, to govern the passions of the body. When there, though looking most wretchedly, she ate more and was calmer than her sister had expected. Had she tried to speak, or had she been conscious of half Mrs. Jennings' well-meant but ill-judged attentions to her, this calmness could not have been maintained. But not a syllable escaped her lips, and the abstraction of her thoughts preserved her in ignorance of everything that was passing before her. She was like a ghost, right? She just sat there and ate, but she couldn't really tell what was going on. She couldn't really concentrate on what was going on around her. Eleanor, who did justice to Mrs. Jennings' kindness, though its effusions were often distressing and sometimes almost ridiculous, made her those acknowledgments and returned her those civilities which her sister could not make or return for herself. Their good friend saw that Marianne was unhappy, and felt that everything was due to her which might make her at all less so. She treated her therefore with all the indulgent fondness of a parent towards a favorite child on the last day of its holidays. Marianne was to have the best place by the fire, was to be tempted to eat by every delicacy in the house, and to be amused by the relation of all the news of the day. Had not Eleanor, in the sad countenance of her sister, seen a check to all mirth, she could have been entertained by Mrs. Jennings' endeavours to cure a disappointment in love by a variety of sweetmeats and olives and a good fire. Sweetmeats here means candies and pastries, something sweet. As soon, however, as the consciousness of all this was forced by continual repetition on Marianne, she could stay no longer. With a hasty exclamation of misery and a sign to her sister not to follow her, she directly got up and hurried out of the room. So we've talked about Mrs. Jennings here. In a way, she is a terrible character because she's so inappropriate. She is inappropriately curious. She's impertinent. She wants to know all about other people's affairs, especially love affairs and young people's affairs. But she has a very good heart, and here she sees how Marianne is hurting. So she treats her like a parent treats their favorite child on their last day of holidays. She gives her all she thinks that could cheer her up. The best place by the fire, the best food, sweet food. But that doesn't help, and Marianne doesn't even notice this kindness, although Eleanor does and acknowledges that. Poor soul, cried Mrs. Jennings as soon as she was gone. How it grieves me to see her. And I declare if she is not gone away without finishing her wine. And the dried cherries, too. Lord, nothing seems to do her any good. I'm sure if I knew of anything she would like, I would send all over the town for it. Sweet. Well, it is the oddest thing to me that a man should use such a pretty girl so ill. But when there is plenty of money on one side and next to none on the other, Lord bless you, they care no more about such things. And Eleanor, very alert. Oh, the lady then, Miss Grey, I think you called her, is very rich. 50,000 pounds, my dear. Did you ever see her? A smart, stylish girl, they say, but not handsome. I remember her aunt very well, Biddy Henshaw. She married a very wealthy man, but the family are all rich together. 50,000 pounds, and by all accounts it won't come before it's wanted, for they say he is all to pieces. No wonder dashing about with his curricle and hunters. Well, it don't signify talking, but when a young man, be he who he will, comes and makes love to a pretty girl and promises marriage, he has no business to fly off from his word only because he grows poor and a richer girl is ready to have him. Why don't he, in such a case, sell his horses, let his house, turn off his servants, and make a thorough reform at once? I warrant you Miss Marianne would have been ready to wait till matters came round. But that won't do nowadays. Nothing in the way of pleasure can ever be given up by the young men of this age. So there is the answer to what is going on. And Eleanor also understands. Miss Grey is rich, and Mr. Willoughby was accumulating so many debts because of his extravagant lifestyle. Mrs. Jennings says that he was dashing about his curricle and hunters. So the curricle is was a type of fashionable carriage. So he would open, if I'm not mistaken, he would ride this kind of carriage to show off. And the hunters, so the dogs that he would have to hunt, were very expensive to keep as well, and the horses. And there is a very interesting note here about the social context, so we understand their situation better. Let's take a look. 475. So Miss Grey has 50,000 pounds, a great fortune which, invested in the 5% government funds, produces a handsome income of 2,500 pounds a year. Ironically, about the sum that Marianne considers necessary for happiness. And when you think about it, ironic Jane Austen, of course, it's not a random choice, the same amount of money. So, what Marianne thought as ideal for happiness in a marriage, in a married life, this is the amount of money that Miss Grey has at her disposal that Willoughby does not, and that Marianne does not either. Um, and also the name mentioned here. So Mrs. Jennings remembers that Miss Grey is the niece of Biddy Henshaw. Now, this name is very telling. Let's take a look. Biddy Henshaw, a relentlessly middle-class name that signals Miss Grey's status as a nouveau riche, commercial heiress. Mrs. Jennings, a tradesman's wife herself, has long known the family. Mrs. Jennings also comes from a family. She married into a family that became rich due to business, to trade. So they were not born rich. They were not born in the aristocracy, but they made their way there with money. And remember, we talked about this before. There was huge prejudice. So the old aristocracy, the born rich, the born wealthy, the families with a traditional name, with titles, with land, they did not accept or did not want to accept the arrival of this nouveau riche, of this new rich people that did not have any land, that did not have any traditional family name, that did not have any titles. Who do they think they are to be meddling in our society? But they have money. And at this point, already early 19th century, aristocracy is decaying. It is going down. It will take another 100 years for that to really collapse. But there are a lot of characters in Jane Austen's novels that are noble. They are aristocrats. They have names, family names, but they don't have much money anymore. Think of the Elliots in Persuasion. And on the other hand, there's this new group of people that came from middle class ranks, but that made their fortunes through trade and now have a lot of money, but they don't have titles. So then marriages would be made to solve this problem. So you see here how Miss Grey comes from a family that has money but no title, and Willoughby comes from a family that has title but no money. Very good. That's very important for us to understand the context of the time. And now it's clear for Eleanor why Willoughby is marrying Miss Grey. Eleanor asks, "Do you know what kind of a girl Miss Grey is? Is she said to be amiable?" "I never heard any harm of her. Indeed, I hardly ever heard her mentioned, except that Mrs. Taylor did say this morning that one day Miss Walker hinted to her that she believed the web of gossip." Okay, again, except that Mrs. Taylor did say this morning that one day Miss Walker hinted to her that she believed Mr. and Mrs. Allison would not be sorry to have Miss Grey married, for she and Mrs. Allison could never agree. And who are the Allisons? Her guardians, my dear. But now she is of age and may choose for herself, and a pretty choice she has made. What now? After pausing a moment, your poor sister is gone to her own room, I suppose, to moan by herself. Is there nothing one can get to comfort her? Poor dear, it seems quite cruel to let her be alone. Well, by and by we shall have a few friends, and that will amuse her a little. What shall we play at? She hates whist, I know, a card game. But is there no round game she cares for? Dear ma'am, this kindness is quite unnecessary. Marianne, I dare say, will not leave her room again this evening. I shall persuade her, if I can, to go early to bed, for I am sure she wants rest. I believe that will be best for her. Let her name her own supper and go to bed. Lord, no wonder she has been looking so bad and so cast down this last week or two, for this matter, I suppose, has been hanging over her head as long as that. And so that letter that came today finished it. Poor soul. I'm sure if I had had a notion of it, I would not have joked her about it for all my money. But then, how should I guess such a thing? I made sure of its being nothing but a common love letter, and young people like to be laughed at about them. Lord, how concerned Sir John and my daughters will be when they hear it. If I had had my senses about me, I might have called in Conduit Street in my way home and told them of it. But I shall see them tomorrow. See how Mrs. Jennings pays attention to details. She observes a lot. So she observed that Marianne received a letter this morning. I remember that she left the room, and then in the letter it was from Willoughby. And now she can't wait to tell her daughter, Lady Middleton, and Sir John. She wants to spread the gossip. It would be unnecessary, I am sure, for you to caution Mrs. Palmer and Sir John against ever naming Mr. Willoughby, or making the slightest allusion to what has passed before my sister. Their own good nature must point out to them the real cruelty of appearing to know anything about it when she's present. And the less that may ever be said to myself on the subject, the more my feelings will be spared, as you, my dear madam, will easily believe. Oh, Lord, yes, that I do indeed. It must be terrible for you to hear it talked of. And as for your sister, I'm sure I would not mention a word about it to her for the world. You saw I did not all dinner time. No more would Sir John nor my daughters, for they are very thoughtful and considerate. In their own ways, they are. Especially if I give them a hint, as I certainly will. For my part, I think the less that is said about such things, the better. The sooner it is blown over and forgot. And what good does talking ever do, In this affair, it can only do harm. More so, perhaps, than in many cases of a similar kind, for it has been attended by circumstances which, for the sake of everyone concerned in it, make it unfit to become the public conversation. I must do this justice to Mr. Willoughby. He has broken no positive engagement with my sister. Law, my dear, don't pretend to defend him. No positive engagement indeed, after taking her all over Allenham House and fixing on the very rooms they were to live in hereafter. So there was not an explicit engagement, but that kind of behavior also counted. It was an implicit engagement. Eleanor, for her sister's sake, could not press the subject farther, and she hoped it was not required of her for Willoughby's, since though Marianne might lose much, he could gain very little by the enforcement of the real truth. After a short silence on both sides, Mrs. Jennings, with all her natural hilarity, burst forth again. Well, my dear, it is a true saying about an ill wind, for it will be all the better for Colonel Brandon. He will have her at last. Ah, that he will. Mind me now if they ain't married by midsummer. Lord, how he'll chuckle over this news. I hope he will come tonight. It will be all to one a better match for your sister. 2,000 a year without debt or drawback, except the little love child. Indeed, I had forgot her. But she may be apprenticed out at small cost. And then what does it signify? Delaford is a nice place, I can tell you. Exactly what I call a nice old-fashioned place. Delaford is Colonel Brandon's home. Full of comforts and conveniences, quite shut in with great garden walls that are covered with the best fruit trees in the country, and such a mulberry tree in one corner. Lord, how Charlotte and I did stuff the only time we were there. Then there is a dovecot, some delightful stew ponds, and a very pretty canal, and everything, in short, that one could wish for. And moreover, it is close to the church, and only a quarter of a mile from the turnpike road. So it is never dull, for if you only go and sit up in an old yew arbor behind the house, you may see all the carriages that pass along. Oh, it is a nice place. A butcher hard by in the village, and the parsonage house within a stone's throw. To my fancy, 1,000 times prettier than Barton Park, where they are forced to send 3 miles for their meat, and I have not a neighbor nearer than your mother. Well, I shall spirit up the colonel as soon as I can. One shoulder of mutton, drives another down. if we can but put Willoughby out of her head. So now Mrs. Jennings is already busy with another love matching. So if Marianne is not to have Willoughby, then all the better, because Colonel Brandon now can have Marianne. But we know how Marianne feels about Colonel Brandon, and she goes on to talk about his property. It is a very nice property. The only thing, according to Mrs. Jennings, is a little love child. Remember Miss Williams, who is supposedly an illegitimate daughter of Colonel Brandon. But she says, but you know what? It's not a really big deal. She may be apprenticed out. Now, what does it mean to be apprenticed out? Let's take a look here. To apprentice the child to a trade or craft, which Mrs. Jennings' background in trade would deem the most eligible way to make the child economically self-sufficient at a time when illegitimacy was a significant stigma. Treatment of the illegitimate Harriet Smith in Emma, though generous and kindly meant, puts her at an economic disadvantage. As Mr. Knightley says, she has been taught nothing useful and is too young and too simple to have acquired anything herself, and will likely continue a dependent with Mrs. Goddard till she grow desperate and is glad to catch at the old writing master's son. So an illegitimate child did not have the same right as a legitimate child. So even though Colonel Brandon is wealthy, has big property, an illegitimate child would not have right to that, would not have access to that at all. So Mrs. Jennings thinks of a way he could discharge of that illegitimate child and make her self-sufficient financially, and that is to apprentice her out. So to send her to be apprenticed to a specific trade. So, well, women, speaking of women, that would be a governess or a teacher, something like that. If it were a man, then it could be a blacksmith, a jeweler, some kind of activity that would make them financially self-sufficient. So the unfairness of it all, right? That's how society worked. And that stigma still has echoes in our contemporary society. Let's continue. If we can but do that, ma'am, to get Willoughby out of her head, said Eleanor, we shall do very well with or without Colonel Brandon. Because Eleanor knows how her sister feels about him. And then rising, she went away to join Marianne, whom she found, as she expected, in her own room, leaning in silent misery over the small remains of a fire, which till Eleanor's entrance had been her only light. You had better leave me, was all the notice that her sister received from her. I will leave you, said Eleanor, if you will go to bed. But this, from the momentary perverseness of impatient suffering, she at first refused to do. Her sister's earnest, though gentle persuasion, however, soon softened her to compliance, and Eleanor saw her lay her aching head on the pillow, and saw her, as she hoped, in a way to get some quiet rest before she left her. In the drawing-room, whither she then repaired, she was soon joined by Mrs. Jennings, with a wine-glass full of something in her hand. My dear, said she, entering, I have just recollected that I have some of the finest old Constantia wine in the house that ever was tasted, so I have brought a glass of it for your sister. Just a side note, Constantia wine is a sweet wine made in South Africa. So something very hard to come by, and it could hint at Mrs. Jennings' husband's activity. So remember, all we know is that he made his way into wealth through trade. So it might have been the trade of wine, and that's why she still had these collections of wine, special wines in her house. So, and I have brought a glass of it for your sister. My poor husband, how fond he was of it. Whenever he had a touch of his old colicky gout, he said it did him more good than anything else in the world. Do take it to your sister. Dear ma'am, replied Eleanor, smiling at the difference of the complaints for which it was recommended. The wine, right? It was recommended for her husband's gout, and Mrs. Jennings thinks it could also work for Marianne's heartbreak. How good you are! But I have just left Marianne in bed, and I hope almost asleep. And as I think nothing will be of so much service to her as rest, if you will give me leave, I will drink the wine myself. Mrs. Jennings, though regretting that she had not been 5 minutes earlier, was satisfied with the compromise, and Eleanor, as she swallowed the chief of it, reflected that, though its good effects on a colicky gout were at present of little importance to her, its healing powers on a disappointed heart might be as reasonably tried on herself as on her sister. Oh, that's sweet. Both heartbroken, both sisters heartbroken. Colonel Brandon came in while the party were at tea, and by his manner of looking round the room for Marianne, Eleanor immediately fancied that he neither expected nor wished to see her there, and in short, that he was already aware of what occasioned her absence. Mrs. Jennings was not struck by the same thought, for soon after his entrance she walked across the room to the tea table where Eleanor presided and whispered, "The colonel looks as grave as ever you see. He knows nothing of it. Do tell him, my dear." So see how they think differently, Mrs. Jennings and Eleanor. Because Colonel Brandon is so serious, even more than usual, Eleanor knows that he knows the truth. And on the contrary, Mrs. Jennings thinks that, oh no, he doesn't know about it yet. Otherwise, he would be very happy indeed with the news, which couldn't be farther from the truth. I mean, yes, happy, but not happy with Marianne's suffering. He shortly afterwards drew a chair close to hers, and with a look which perfectly assured her of his good information, inquired after her sister. "Marianne is not well," said she. "She has been indisposed all day, and we have persuaded her to go to bed." "Perhaps, then," he hesitatingly replied, "what I heard this morning there may be more truth in it than I could believe possible at first." "What did you hear?" "That a gentleman whom I had reason to think, in short, that a man whom I knew to be engaged. But how shall I tell you? If you know it already, as surely you must, I may be spared." "You mean," answered Eleanor with forced calmness, "Mr. Willoughby's marriage with Miss Grey. Yes, we do know it all. This seems to have been a day of general elucidation, for this very morning first unfolded it to us. Mr. Willoughby is unfathomable. Where did you hear it?" "In a stationer's shop in Pall Mall, where I had business. Two ladies were waiting for their carriage, and one of them was giving the other an account of the intended match, in a voice so little attempting concealment that it was impossible for me not to hear all." So see how it's already common knowledge. Two ladies were waiting for the carriage and already gossiping about it. And that's how Colonel Brandon found out. The name of Willoughby, John Willoughby, frequently repeated, first caught my attention, and what followed was a positive assertion that everything was now finally settled respecting his marriage with Miss Grey. It was no longer to be a secret. It would take place even within a few weeks, with many particulars of preparations and other matters. One thing specially I remember because it served to identify the man still more. As soon as the ceremony was over, they were to go to Combe Magna, his seat in Somersetshire. My astonishment, but it would be impossible to describe what I felt. The communicative lady, I learned on inquiry, for I stayed in the shop till they were gone, was a Mrs. Allison, and that, as I have been since informed, is the name of Miss Grey's guardian. It is. But have you likewise heard that Miss Grey has £50,000? In that, if it in anything, we might find an explanation. It may be so, but Willoughby is capable, at least I think. He stopped a moment, then added in a voice which seemed to distrust itself. And your sister, how did she? Her sufferings have been very severe. I have only to hope that they may be proportionably short. It is a most cruel affliction. Till yesterday, I believe she never doubted his regard, and even now, perhaps. But I am almost convinced that he never was really attached to her. He has been very deceitful, and in some points there seems a hardness of heart about him. Ah, said Colonel Brandon, there is indeed. But your sister does not. I think you said so. She does not consider it quite as you do? You know her disposition, and may believe how eagerly she would still justify him if she could. He made no answer, and soon afterwards, by the removal of the tea things and the arrangement of the card parties, the subject was necessarily dropped. Mrs. Jennings, who had watched them with pleasure while they were talking, and who expected to see the effect of Miss Dashwood's communication in such an instantaneous gaiety on Colonel Brandon's face, as might have become a man in the bloom of youth, of hope and happiness, saw him with amazement remain the whole evening more serious and thoughtful than usual. So, the truth is out. This is the end of chapter 8 or chapter 30. The truth is out. Everyone in London knows about Mr. Willoughby's impending marriage to Miss Grey, and the people that know Marianne and that were there in Barton when Willoughby was there with Marianne, they cannot believe that Willoughby would act in such a way. But money explains it all. Miss Grey has £50,000. And Mrs. Jennings sees this as an opportunity for Colonel Brandon to have Marianne as a wife. But we know that Marianne does not feel that way for Colonel Brandon, quite the opposite. But Colonel Brandon, he's not happy with this situation, with the end of the engagement, even if it wasn't an official one, because he knows that Marianne is suffering with it. So see how much of a good heart he has. He's not selfish, otherwise he would be very happy with the situation because it benefits him per se, but he's not happy because he knows how much that will make his beloved suffer. So now let's take a look at chapter 31. And yes, this is a very, very good chapter and very important to understanding the plot. Yes, chapter 31 or chapter 9 from volume 2. Let's continue. From a night of more sleep than she had expected, Marianne awoke the next morning to the same consciousness of misery in which she had closed her eyes. Look, this episode starts through Marianne's point of view, so her voice is slowly returning to the narrative. Eleanor encouraged her as much as possible to talk of what she felt, and before breakfast was ready, they had gone through the subject again and again, with the same steady conviction and affectionate counsel on Eleanor's side, the same impetuous feelings and varying opinions on Marianne's as before. Sometimes she could believe Willoughby to be as unfortunate and as innocent as herself, and at others lost every consolation in the impossibility of acquitting him. At one moment she was absolutely indifferent to the observation of all the world. At another she would seclude herself from it forever, and at a third could resist with energy. In one thing, however, she was uniform. When he came to the point in avoiding, where it was possible, the presence of Mrs. Jennings, and in a determined silence when obliged to endure it. Her heart was hardened against the belief of Mrs. Jennings entering into her sorrows with any compassion. So Marianne was changing opinions all the time about Willoughby, about the whole situation, about being public, about isolating herself. But one thing she was certain of is that she despised the way Mrs. Jennings was making herself part of this private affair and how she was showing her compassion. We know that Mrs. Jennings means it well. You know, she said, if there's anything in London that would comfort her, I would fetch someone to get it. So she means well, but Marianne cannot accept it. So she's being quite harsh. No, 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 it cannot be, Marianne cried. She cannot feel. Her kindness is not sympathy. Her good nature is not tenderness. All that she wants is gossip, and she only likes me now because I supply it. very harsh. It's because Marianne cannot understand others that are different from her, different ways of thinking, of acting, such as Mrs. Jennings. So she has no. She's quite selfish. She wants everyone to think the way she does and to act the way she wants them to act. Eleanor had not needed this to be assured of the injustice to which her sister was often led in her opinion of others by the irritable refinement of her own mind and the too great importance placed by her on the delicacies of a strong sensibility and the graces of a polished manner. Like half the rest of the world, if more than half there be that are clever and good, Marianne, with excellent abilities and excellent disposition, was neither reasonable nor candid. She expected from other people the same opinions and feelings as her own, and she judged of their motives by the immediate effect of their actions on herself. Thus, a circumstance occurred while the sisters were together in their own room after breakfast, which sunk the heart of Mrs. Jennings still lower in her estimation, because through her own weakness it chanced to prove a source of fresh pain to herself, though Mrs. Jennings was governed in it by an impulse of the utmost goodwill. See how prejudiced Marianne is? She still needs to mature a lot in her journey, right? We're still halfway through the novel. So she needs to learn to understand others who think or act differently than herself, or that have different priorities in life, or how this other people's actions affect her. With a letter in her outstretched hand, Mrs. Jennings, and countenance gaily smiling, from the persuasion of bringing comfort, she entered their room saying, "Now, my dear, I bring you something that I am sure will do you good." Marianne heard enough. In one moment, her imagination placed before her a letter from Willoughby, full of tenderness and contrition, explanatory of all that had passed, satisfactory, convincing, and instantly followed by Willoughby himself, rushing eagerly into the room to enforce at her feet, by the eloquence of his eyes, the assurances of his letter. The work of one moment was destroyed by the next. The handwriting of her mother, never till then unwelcome, was before her, and in the acuteness of the disappointment which followed such an ecstasy of more than hope, she felt as if till that instant she had never suffered. Remember the power of Marianne's imagination. So how at the instant she met Willoughby, she already created a character for himself in her mind based on all that she had read before. So novels of sensibility, of heroes in romance novels. She creates this illusion, this idealized image of Willoughby. And when Mrs. Jennings comes bearing a letter and smiling, saying, "Oh, this will bring you comfort," the first thing that comes to Marianne's mind is that it is a letter from Willoughby, and her imagination runs wild, and she creates this whole plot in seconds. And that hope, that ecstasy, is crushed when she recognizes the handwriting of her mother. So it was not a letter from Willoughby, it was from her mother. And Mrs. Jennings, of course, meant well when she brought a letter from Mrs. Dashwood, thinking that it would do good to Marianne to receive a letter from her mom. Of course, she could not anticipate that Marianne's mind would run wild and already create a completely different scenario, and that the reality, a letter from her mom, would actually be a disappointment. The cruelty of Mrs. Jennings no language within her reach in her moments of happiest eloquence could have expressed. The cruelty, this is Marianne's point of view. And now she could reproach her only by the tears which streamed from her eyes with passionate violence. A reproach, however, so entirely lost on its object that after many expressions of pity she withdrew, still referring her to the letter for comfort. But the letter, when she was calm enough to read it, brought little comfort. Willoughby filled every page. Her mother, still confident of their engagement, and relying as warmly as ever on his constancy, had only been roused by Eleanor's application to entreat from Marianne greater openness towards them both. And this with such tenderness towards her, such affection for Willoughby, and such a conviction of their future happiness in each other, that she wept with agony through the whole of it. Her mother still had hopes, still had the conviction that everything was right. All her impatience to be at home again now returned. Her mother was dearer to her than ever, dearer through the very excess of her mistaken confidence in Willoughby, and she was wildly urgent to be gone. Eleanor, unable herself to determine whether it were better for Marianne to be in London or at Barton, offered no counsel of her own except of patience till their mother's wishes could be known, and at length she obtained her sister's consent to wait for that knowledge. Mrs. Jennings left them earlier than usual, for she could not be easy till the Middletons and Palmers were able to grieve as much as herself. In other words, she wanted to spread the news, she wanted to spread the gossip. And positively refusing Eleanor's offered attendance, went out alone for the rest of the morning. Eleanor, with a very heavy heart, aware of the pain she was going to communicate, and perceiving by Marianne's letter how ill she had succeeded in laying any foundation for it, then sat down to write her mother an account of what had passed, and entreat her directions for the future, while Marianne, who came into the drawing room on Mrs. Jennings going away, remained fixed at the table where Eleanor wrote, watching the advancement of her pen, grieving over her for the hardship of such a task, and grieving still more fondly over its effect on her mother. So now Eleanor, because she knows this will be too painful for Marianne, she decides to write a letter to her mom herself to explain what really happened and to ask for directions. What should they do? In this manner they had continued about a quarter of an hour, when Marianne, whose nerves could not then bear any sudden noise, was startled by a rap at the door. "Who can this be?" cried Eleanor. "So early, too. I thought we had been safe." Marianne moved to the window. "Ah, it is Colonel Brandon," said she with vexation. "We are never safe from him. He will not come in as Mrs. Jennings is from home. I will not trust to that." Retreating to her own room. "A man who has nothing to do with his own time has no conscience in his intrusion on that of others." Again, selfish, prejudiced Marianne. She doesn't even know the reason why Colonel Brydon's coming. He thinks that it's only to intrude on her own personal space and time. So she goes to her own room. The event proved her conjecture right, though it was founded on injustice and error. For Colonel Brandon did come in, and Eleanor, who was convinced that solicitude for Marianne brought him thither, and who saw that solicitude in his disturbed and melancholy look, and in his anxious though brief inquiry after her, could not forgive her sister for esteeming him so lightly. "I met Mrs. Jennings in Bond Street," said he after the first salutation, "and she encouraged me to come on. I was the more easily encouraged because I thought it probable that I might find you alone, which I was very desirous of doing. My object, my wish, my sole wish is in desiring it, I hope. I believe it is to be a means of giving comfort. No, I must not say comfort, not present comfort, but conviction, lasting conviction to your sister's mind. My regard for her, for yourself, for your mother, will you allow me to prove it by relating some circumstances which nothing but a very sincere regard, nothing but an earnest desire of being useful? I think I'm justified, though where so many hours have been spent in convincing myself that I am right, is there not some reason to fear I may be wrong?" He stopped. So Colonel Brandon is fighting with his words. You can tell he's very embarrassed and he doesn't know how to act, but he has something very important to say. "I understand you," said Eleanor. "You have something to tell me of Mr. Willoughby that will open his character farther. Your telling it will be the greatest act of friendship that can be shown Marianne. My gratitude will be ensured immediately by any information tending to that end, and hers must be gained by it in time. Pray, pray, let me hear it." You shall, and to be brief, when I quitted Barton last October, but this will give you no idea, I must go farther back. You will find me a very awkward narrator, Miss Dashwood. I hardly know where to begin. A short account of myself, I believe, will be necessary, and it shall be a short one. On such a subject, sighing heavily, I can have little temptation to be diffuse. So Colonel Brandon is going to tell his story. Let's hear it. He stopped a moment for recollection, and then, with another sigh, went on. You have probably entirely forgotten a conversation. It is not to be supposed that it could make any impression on you. A conversation between us one evening at Barton Park. It was the evening of a dance, in which I alluded to a lady I had once known as resembling in some measure your sister Marianne. Indeed, answered Eleanor, I have not forgotten it. He looked pleased by this remembrance and added, if I am not deceived by the uncertainty, the partiality of tender recollection, there is a very strong resemblance between them, as well in mind as person. The same warmth of heart, the same eagerness of fancy and spirits. This lady was one of my nearest relations, an orphan from her infancy, and under the guardianship of my father. Our ages were nearly the same, and from our earliest years we were playfellows and friends. I cannot remember the time when I did not love Eliza, and my affection for her as we grew up was such as perhaps, judging from my present forlorn and cheerless gravity, you might think me incapable of having ever felt. Hers for me was, I believe, fervent as the attachment of your sister to Mr. Willoughby, and it was, though from a different cause, no less unfortunate. At 17 she was lost to me for ever. She was married against her inclination to my brother. Her fortune was large, and our family estate much encumbered. And this, I fear, is all that can be said for the conduct of one who was at once her uncle and guardian. My brother did not deserve her. He did not even love her. I had hoped that her regard for me would support her under any difficulty, and for some time it did. But at last the misery of her situation, for she experienced great unkindness, overcame all her resolution, and though she had promised me that nothing, oh, but how blindly I relate! I have never told you how this was brought on. We were within a few hours of eloping together for Scotland. And that's because it would be easier to marry in Scotland. There were fewer restrictions, did not have to publish the bans some time before the marriage, so it would be easier to marry fast in Scotland. So Colonel Brandon was in love, desperately in love with this woman called Eliza when they were young, but their father forced her to marry Colonel Brandon's brother. And he was a terrible man. So they were on the Colonel Brandon and Eliza were on the verge of eloping for Scotland to marry. But the treachery or the folly of my cousin's maid betrayed us. I was banished to the house of a relation far distant, and she was allowed no liberty, no society, no amusement, till my father's point was gained. I had depended on her fortitude too far, and the blow was a severe one. But had her marriage been happy, so young as I then was, a few months must have reconciled me to it, or at least I should not have now to lament it. This, however, was not the case. My brother had no regard for her. His pleasures were not what they ought to have been, and from the first he treated her unkindly. The consequence of this upon a mind so young, so lively, so inexperienced as Mrs. Brandon's was but too natural. She resigned herself at first to all the misery of her situation. And happy had it been if she had not lived to overcome those regrets which the remembrance of me occasioned. But can we wonder that with such a husband to provoke inconstancy, and without a friend to advise or restrain her, for my father lived only a few months after their marriage, and I was with my regiment in the East Indies, she should fall? Had I remained in England, perhaps, but I meant to promote the happiness of both by removing from her for years, and for that purpose had procured my exchange. The shock which her marriage had given me, he continued in a voice of great agitation, was of trifling weight, was nothing to what I felt when I heard about 2 years afterwards of her divorce. It was that which threw this gloom, even now the recollection of what I suffered. So, Colonel Brandon's brother treated Eliza terribly, terribly, and she had no one to turn to. She was forced to live as a prisoner in her house. So Colonel Brandon says, yeah, it is no wonder that she fell. She had no one to help her. And he adds that he was wretched when he heard of her marriage, but even more when 2 years afterwards he heard of her divorce. Now, what is that? For us contemporary readers, we would think, oh, but that was a relief. She got divorced. She got rid of the terrible man. But divorce was not given easily at the time. So that means something. Let's take a look at this note. Divorce. The grounds for the divorce assumed to be Mrs. Branson's adultery. Mrs. Brandon's adultery. There was almost no access to divorce in England at this time, though divorce by Act of Parliament became possible at the end of the 17th century. The grounds were extremely limited, and the process was enormously expensive. No more than 300 divorces were granted in the whole period up to 1857, when the Matrimonial Causes Act set up divorce courts for England and Wales. 300 divorces in about 200 years. And that is because it was not easily given. It was only if it was extremely expensive, so only rich people could get divorce, and it was only granted in the case of adultery. And given the circumstances that Mr. Brandon, so Colonel Brandon's brother, kept all the money and property, etc., it means that it was her adultery. That's why Colonel Brandon was so shocked when he heard of her divorce, because that means that she was unfaithful to her husband. He could say no more, and rising hastily walked for a few minutes about the room. Eleanor, affected by his relation, and still more by his distress, could not speak. He saw her concern, and coming to her, took her hand, pressed it, and kissed it with grateful respect. A few minutes more of silent exertion enabled him to proceed with composure. Again, the word exertion. It was nearly 3 years after this unhappy period before I returned to England. So throughout her marriage and her divorce, Colonel Brandon was away. So only 3 years after that, he returned to England. My first care when I did arrive was, of course, to seek for her, but the search was as fruitless as it was melancholy. I could not trace her beyond her first seducer, and there was every reason to fear that she had removed from him only to sink deeper in a life of sin. So she probably ran away with her first seducer, which means that there were others. And after being abandoned by her first seducer, she sunk deeper in a life of sin, which probably means that she was involved in prostitution, probably to earn a living, right? Because she was left with no home, no money. So how would she be able to survive? Her legal allowance was not adequate to her fortune, nor sufficient for her comfortable maintenance. And I learned from my brother that the power of receiving it had been made over some months before to another person. He imagined, and calmly could he imagine it, that her extravagance and consequent distress had obliged her to dispose of it for some immediate relief. So she was in trouble for money. At last, however, and after I had been 6 months in England, I did find her. Regard for a former servant of my own, who had since fallen into misfortune, carried me to visit him in a sponging house where he was confined for debt. And there, in the same house, under a similar confinement, was my unfortunate sister. So he calls her now the love of his life, his unfortunate sister, because she had been married to his brother. And he found her at a sponging house. Now, what does that mean? Let's take a look at this. A private house of confinement kept by a bailiff or sheriff's officer for fees and used to house debtors to give them time to settle their debts before the next step, debtor's prison. The institution is inescapably associated with the fate of the betrayed and dying heroine in Samuel Richardson's Clarissa. So in the 19th century, debt was a crime, and you would go to a debtor's prison for owing money to someone. But there was this step earlier in which the person would be sent to a sponging house, which was kind of a lodging, an inn, where people would, of course, for a fee, try to get up on their feet, try to get stuff back on track, and not be sent to debtor's prison. That's where he found her. So altered, so faded, worn down by acute suffering of every kind. Hardly could I believe the melancholy and sickly figure before me to be the remains of the lovely, blooming, healthful girl on whom I had once doted. What I endured in so beholding her, but I have no right to wound your feelings by attempting to describe it. I have pained you too much already. That she was, to all appearance, in the last stage of a consumption, tuberculosis, was, yes, in such a situation, it was my greatest comfort. So she'd better die than be, continue living a life of sin or be sent to prison. Life could do nothing for her beyond giving time for a better preparation for death, and that was given. I saw her placed in comfortable lodgings and under proper attendance. I visited her every day during the rest of her short life. I was with her in her last moments. Again he stopped to recover himself, and Eleanor spoke her feelings in an exclamation of tender concern at the fate of his unfortunate friend. Your sister, I hope, cannot be offended, said he, by the resemblance I have fancied between her and my poor disgraced relation. Their fates, their fortunes cannot be the same, and had the natural sweet disposition of the one been guarded by a firmer mind or a happier marriage, she might have been all that you will live to see the other be. But to what does all this lead? I seem to have been distressing you for nothing. Oh, Miss Dashwood, a subject such as this, untouched for 14 years. It is dangerous to handle it at all. I will be more collected, more concise. She left to my care her only child, a little girl, the offspring of her first guilty connection, who was then about 3 years old. She loved the child and had always kept it with her. It was a valued, a precious trust to me. Interestingly, that he refers to the girl as it, right? And gladly would I have discharged it in the strictest sense by watching over her education myself, had the nature of our situation allowed it. But I had no family, no home, and my little Eliza was therefore placed at school. So when Eliza, his love, dies, she leaves her daughter to be taken care of by Colonel Brandon, and her name is also Eliza. And he cannot, at that point in his life, he could not take her in. Of course, it would be socially unacceptable, unaccepted. So he sends her to school. I saw her there whenever I could, and after the death of my brother, which happened about 5 years ago and which left to me the possession of the family property, she frequently visited me at Delaford. So after his brother died, he became the inheritor of Delaford, and then he had the liberty to do as he pleased. So he would bring Miss Eliza, to visit him there. I called her a distant relation, but I am well aware that I have in general been suspected of a much nearer connection with her. So people like Mrs. Jennings had wrongly assumed that this girl, Miss Williams, Eliza Williams, was an illegitimate child of Colonel Brandon. But she isn't. She is the illegitimate child of his first love, and he takes care of her. Um, so look what a good person Colonel Brandon is, right? It is now 3 years ago. She had just reached her 14th year, so she was 14 years old, Eliza Williams, that I removed her from school to place her under the care of a very respectable woman residing in Dorsetshire, who had the charge of 4 or 5 other girls of about the same time of life. And 2 years I had every reason to be pleased with her situation. So until she was 16. But last February, almost 12 months back, she suddenly disappeared. I had allowed her imprudently, as it has since turned out, at her earnest desire to go to Bath with one of her youngest friends, who was attending her father there for his health. So she's grown. She was then 16 years old, and she asked to go to Bath with a friend. So remember, Bath is a city where people would go, either old people would go there to take care of their health, which is the case of Eliza's friend's father, or for the social activities. It was a very busy city, that, especially in one specific season. So there would be balls, assemblies, a lot of people walking in the streets, and that's where Eliza went. Um, I knew him to be a very good sort of man, and I thought well of his daughter, better than she deserved, for with the most obstinate and ill-judged secrecy, she would tell nothing, would give no clue, though she certainly knew all. He, her father, a well-meaning but not a quick-sighted man, could really, I believe, give no information, for he had been generally confined to the house, while the girls were ranging over the town and making what acquaintance they chose. Two 16-year-old girls alone in Bath meeting random people. And he tried to convince me, as thoroughly as he was convinced himself, of his daughter's being entirely unconcerned in the business. In short, I could learn nothing but that she was gone. All the rest, for 8 long months, was left to conjecture. What I thought, what I feared, may be imagined, and what I suffered too. So she disappeared for 8 months. Good heavens! Cried Eleanor. Could it be? Could Willoughby? The first news that reached me of her, he continued, came in a letter from herself last October, when they were in Barton. It was forwarded to me from Delaford, and I received it on the very morning of our intended party to Whitwell. And this was the reason of my leaving Barton so suddenly, which I am sure must at the time have appeared strange to everybody, and which I believe gave offence to some. Little did Mr. Willoughby imagine, I suppose, when his looks censured me for incivility in breaking up the party, that I was called away to the relief of one whom he had made poor and miserable. But had he known it, what would it have availed? Would he have been less gay or less happy in the smiles of your sister? No, he had already done that, which no man who can feel for another would do. He had left the girl whose youth and innocence he had seduced in a situation of the utmost distress, with no creditable home, no help, no friends, ignorant of his address. So Willoughby seduced Eliza in Bath, ran away with her for some time, and completely abandoned her, left her with no money, no friends, and ignorant of his address. He had left her promising to return. He neither returned, nor wrote, nor relieved her. This is beyond everything, exclaimed Eleanor. His character is now before you, expensive, dissipated, and worse than both. Knowing all this, as I have now known it many weeks, guess what I must have felt on seeing your sister as fond of him as ever, and on being assured that she was to marry him. Guess what I must have felt for all your sakes. So he knew that, but it would be inappropriate to share this news. It was very private business, and he had it had no business interfering with Marianne's personal choice. So that's why he had been so gloomy and quiet and serious and observing, Marian. When I came to you last week and found you alone, I came determined to know the truth, though irresolute what to do when it was known. My behavior must have seemed strange to you then, but now you will comprehend it. To suffer you all to be so deceived, to see your sister, but what could I do? I had no hope of interfering with success, and sometimes I thought your sister's influence might yet reclaim him. But now, after such dishonorable usage, who can tell what were his designs on her? Whatever they may have been, however, she may now and hereafter doubtless will turn with gratitude towards her own condition when she compares it with that of my poor Eliza, when she considers the wretched and hopeless situation of this poor girl and pictures her to herself with an affection for him as strong, still as strong as her own, and with a mind tormented by self-reproach which must attend her through life. Surely this comparison must have its use with her. So that's why Colonel Brandon tells all this story to Eleanor, so that Eleanor can tell Marianne, and so that Marianne can compare her situation with Eliza's situation and be happy about the outcome of her in her case. Willoughby was stopped before he went too far, but Miss Eliza was not as lucky, right? Colonel Brandon continues. She will feel her own sufferings to be nothing. They proceed from no misconduct and can bring no disgrace. On the contrary, every friend must be made still more her friend by them. Concern for her unhappiness and respect for her fortitude under it must strengthen every attachment. Use your own discretion, however, in communicating to her what I have told you. You must know best what will be its effect. But had I not seriously and from my heart believed it might be of service, might lessen her regrets, I would not have suffered myself to trouble you with this account of my family afflictions, with a recital which may seem to have been intended to raise myself at the expense of others. Eleanor's thanks followed this speech with grateful earnestness, attended to with the assurance of her expecting material advantage to Marianne from the communication of what had passed. I have been more pained, said she, by her endeavours to acquit him than by all the rest, for it irritates her mind more than the most perfect conviction of his unworthiness can do. Now, though at first she will suffer much, I am sure she will soon become easier. Have you, she continued after a short silence, ever seen Mr. Willoughby since you left him at Barton? Yes, he replied gravely. Once I have. One meeting was unavoidable. Eleanor, startled by his manner, looked at him anxiously, saying, What? Have you met him too? I could meet him in no other way. What do you think Colonel Brandon means when he says he met Willoughby once, because that was unavoidable, and that he could meet him in no other way? What are the implications? What can you read between the lines here? Let's take a look at this footnote. One meeting was unavoidable, and that was for a duel. Duels were illegal outside the military, but were not uncommon as the means for settling a point of honor among gentlemen of Brandon and Willoughby's class. In the case of a fatality, the survivor could be tried for murder. But as contemporary Louis Simon's journal describes it, the law is suffered to sleep. It is disregarded, and if the motives of the duel are such as public opinion sanctions, they are tacitly admitted likewise by the law, and a premeditated duel passes now for an accidental rencontre, or anything but murder, because the cases are few and are deemed a useful corrective of manners. So duels were illegal, but that does not mean that they didn't happen. They were still vestiges of this medieval past in which duels were used to settle matters of honor. So man to man, face to face, only one could leave alive. So they met face to face, Willoughby and Colonel Brandon, to settle this matter of honor. And although it was prohibited by law, the law looked the other way, especially if they were important people, like people from the rank of Willoughby and Brandon, and depending on the reasons for the duel, this situation there that we've just read about would be considered um, an, a good enough of a reason for a duel to take place. So Colonel Brandon says, I could meet him in no other way. Eliza had confessed to me, though most reluctantly, the name of her lover, and when he returned to town, which was within a fortnight after myself, we met by appointment, he to defend, I to punish his conduct. We returned unwounded, and the meeting therefore never got abroad. So they met for this duel, but no one got hurt. Eleanor sighed over the fancied necessity of this. Eleanor probably thinks this is ridiculous, but to a man and a soldier, she presumed not to censor it. Such, said Colonel Brandon after a pause, has been the unhappy resemblance between the fate of mother and daughter, and so imperfectly have I discharged my trust. Is she still in town? No, as soon as she recovered from her lying in, for I found her near her delivery, I removed her and her child into the country, and there she remains. So Eliza was pregnant of Willoughby. She gave birth to Willoughby's illegitimate child. So Eliza, the daughter, suffered the same or similar fate as Eliza, the mother, the love of Colonel Brandon's life. But Colonel Brandon was determined that Marianne would not suffer the same fate. Recollecting soon afterwards that he was probably dividing Eleanor from her sister, he put an end to his visit, receiving from her again the same grateful acknowledgments, and leaving her full of compassion and esteem for him. And that is the end of chapter 32, or chapter 9, volume 2. So now Eleanor is even more appreciative of Colonel Brandon. She admires him even more. To know what he went through, what he suffered, the reason why he's such collected and quiet and reserved man. He suffered for love in the past. He suffered twice with rakes like his brother and Willoughby. And he was determined not to let Marianne suffer the same fate. So, wow, what do you think about Colonel Brandon's history? It's quite a narrative, and I'm curious, you're probably curious as well, to know Marianne's reaction to learning all of this. And this is what we find out in chapter 32 or chapter 10 of volume 2. Let's take a look. When the particulars of this conversation were repeated by Miss Dashwood to her sister, as they very soon were, the effect on her was not entirely such as the former had hoped to see. Not that Marianne appeared to distrust the truth of any part of it, for she listened to it all with the most steady and submissive attention, made neither objection nor remark, attempted no vindication of Willoughby, and seemed to show by her tears that she felt it to be impossible. But though this behavior assured Eleanor that the conviction of his guilt was carried home to her mind, though she saw with satisfaction the effect of it, in her no longer avoiding Colonel Brandon when he called, in her speaking to him, even voluntarily speaking, with a kind of compassionate respect, and though she saw her spirits less violently irritated than before, she did not see her less wretched. Her mind did become settled, but it was settled in a gloomy dejection. She felt the loss of Willoughby's character yet more heavily than she had felt the loss of his heart. His seduction and desertion of Miss Williams, the misery of that poor girl, and the doubt of what his designs might once have been on herself, preyed altogether so much on her spirits that she could not bring herself to speak of what she felt even to Eleanor, and brooding over her sorrows in silence gave more pain to her sister than could have been communicated by the most open and most frequent confession of them. So here we see something very interesting. Marianne hears everything that Eleanor says. She does not doubt that all of it is true. She even starts looking at Colonel Brandon differently. She looks at him with what is it? Kind of compassionate respect, because now she knows what he has suffered. He's not just an old man that likes to wear flannel waistcoats. He's a man that suffered for love, which is quite romantic, and she would enjoy that kind of romantic story. But what she suffers the most about is not, yes, she suffered with when she lost Willoughby's heart, but she suffers now even more with the loss of Willoughby's character. And remember, in the beginning of today's session, I said how Marianne created this character in her mind, this idealized version, an illusion of what Willoughby, of who Willoughby is. So the hero in a novel, the gallant, charming man who would sweep her off her feet, would marry her and take her to an old mansion where she would see picturesque beauty and live happily ever after. That does not exist. And she suffers the crushing of this image that she created. She suffers with the crushing of this illusion. This illusion is, this romantic illusion is shattered, and that is painful for Marianne to accept. That is also an important step towards self-development and towards maturing. So she had to remember she's a romantic girl. So she needs to grow and to grow, she needs to be more in contact with reality and not an idealized version of reality. So it's a milestone in her journey, this moment, when her illusion of Willoughby is shattered. To give the feelings of the language of Mrs. Dashwood on receiving and answering Elinor's letter would be only to give a repetition of what her daughters had already felt and said, of a disappointment hardly less painful than Marianne's, and an indignation even greater than Elinor's. Long letters from her, quickly succeeding each other, arrived to tell all that she suffered and thought, to express her anxious solicitude for Marianne, and entreat she would bear up with fortitude under this misfortune. That indeed must the nature of Marianne's affliction be, when her mother could talk of fortitude. Mortifying and humiliating must be the origin of those regrets which she could wish her not to indulge. Powerful mom here, Mrs. Dashwood, is indignant. She is furious, and she writes long letters, indignated letters. And she, for the first time, she does not tell Marianne to indulge in her feelings, but to bear them with fortitude. Against the interest of her own individual comfort, Mrs. Dashwood had determined that it would be better for Marianne to be anywhere at that time than at Barton, where everything within her view would be bringing back the past in the strongest and most afflicting manner. By constantly placing Willoughby before her, such as she had always seen him there. She recommended it to her daughters, therefore, by all means not to shorten their visit to Mrs. Jennings, the length of which, though never exactly fixed, had been expected by all to comprise at least 5 or 6 weeks. Visits were very long at that time. It took a long time to travel there. It took them almost 3 days just to get there. So it was more or less accepted that the visit would last at least 5 to 6 weeks. A variety of occupations, of objects, and of company, which could not be procured at Barton, would be inevitable there, and might yet, she hoped, cheat Marianne at times into some interest beyond herself, and even into some amusement, much as the idea of both might now be spurned by her. From all danger of seeing Willoughby again, her mother considered her to be at least equally safe in town as in the country, since his acquaintance must now be dropped by all who called themselves her friends. Design could never bring them in each other's way. Negligence could never leave them exposed to a surprise, and chance had less in its favour in the crowd of London than even in the retirement of Barton, where it might force him before her while paying that visit at Allenham on his marriage, which Mrs. Dashwood, from foreseeing at first as a probable event, had brought herself to expect as a certain one. So from that moment onwards, No one was allowed to see or even talk about Willoughby. Um, all the friends would drop his acquaintance. So it was not very probable that Marianne would encounter him in a social event because he would not be invited by those who know and care for Marianne. She had yet another reason for wishing her children to remain where they were. A letter from her son in law had told her that he and his wife were to be in town before the middle of February, and she judged it right that they should sometimes see their brother. Their brother, John Dashwood, is back in the narrative. Marianne had promised to be guided by her mother's opinion, and she submitted to it therefore without opposition, though it proved perfectly different from what she wished and expected, though she felt it to be entirely wrong, formed on mistaken grounds, and that by requiring her longer continuance in London, it deprived her of the only possible alleviation of her wretchedness, the personal sympathy of her mother, and doomed her to such society and such scenes as must prevent her ever knowing a moment's rest. But it was a matter of great consolation to her that what brought evil to herself would bring good to her sister. And Eleanor, on the other hand, suspecting that it would not be in her power to avoid Edward entirely, comforted herself by thinking that, though their longer stay would therefore militate against her own happiness, it would be better for Marianne than an immediate return into Devonshire. And now the sisters' narratives are turned again. So the balance is shifted again. So we follow one of the two sisters for a while in the narrative, and then her, let's say, journey stops, and then the journey of the other continues. There are ups and downs. So now Marianne's story is hits a pause when she's feeling unfortunate and suffering, and now with Edward coming into town, Eleanor's story moves forward. Let's see how that will play out. Her carefulness in guarding her sister from ever hearing Willoughby's name mentioned was not thrown away. Marianne, though without knowing it herself, reaped all its advantage, for neither Mrs. Jennings, nor Sir John, nor even Mrs. Palmer herself, ever spoke of him before her. Eleanor wished that the same forbearance could have extended towards herself, but that was impossible, and she was obliged to listen day after day to the indignation of them all. Sir John could not have thought it possible. A man of whom he had always had such reason to think well, such a good-natured fellow. He did not believe there was a bolder rider in England. So he uses the same sentence to refer to him in a good way and in a bad way. It was an unaccountable business. He wished him at the devil with all his heart. He would not speak another word to him, meet him where he might for all the world. No, not if it were to be by the side of Barton Covert, and they were kept waiting for 2 hours together. Such a scoundrel of a fellow, such a deceitful dog. It was only the last time they met that he had offered him one of Folly's puppies, and this was the end of it. Mrs. Palmer, in her way, was equally angry. She was determined to drop his acquaintance immediately, and she was very thankful that she had never been acquainted with him at all. Contradictions in Mrs. Palmer's points of view are really, really funny. So the narrator juxtaposes these contradictions on purpose for humorous effect. So she was determined to drop all the acquaintance she had with Willoughby, and she was thankful that she never met him at all. She wished with all her heart Combe Magna was not so near Cleveland, but it did not signify, for it was a great deal too far off to visit. She hated him so much that she was resolved never to mention his name again, and she should tell everybody she saw how good for nothing he was. Again, so she says that she was resolved never to mention his name again, and to tell everyone she knew that he was a good for nothing. So in order to do that, she would have to speak his name. So now we see how each of the characters is showing their indignation and their support to Marianne, although behind her back. to Eleanor, and Eleanor has to suffer hearing this again and again, but they mean well, and they're taking Marianne's side. And it's interesting to see how each one of the characters responds differently. The rest of Mrs. Palmer's sympathy was shown in procuring all the particulars in her power of the approaching marriage and communicating them to Eleanor. How would this be helpful? She could soon tell at what coachmakers the new carriage was building, by what painter Mr. Willoughby's portrait was drawn, and at what warehouse Miss Grey's clothes might be seen. Now, these are some interesting contextual notes about announcing marriages in Regency England, especially marriages from the upper classes. So let's take a look here. First, the carriage. So a new carriage, essential to the ritual show associated with marriages of wealth and status. In Maria Bertram's marriage to Mr. Rushworth in Mansfield Park, nothing could be objected except that the carriage which conveyed the bride and bridegroom from the church door to Sotherton was the same chaise which Mr. Rushworth had used for a 12-month before. So that could not do. It had to be a new carriage specifically for this. And Mrs. Elton flaunts her social pretensions by the acquisition of a new carriage on her engagement in Emma. The carriage, we had disappointments about the carriage. One morning, I remember he came to me quite in despair. And a family carriage, like General Tilney's in Northanger Abbey, drawn by the highly fed 4 horses of a gentleman, would cost between £500 and £600, 500 and £800. A good quality Leicester vehicle could cost £200 upwards. So it was expensive to keep a carriage, and you would need a new carriage to show off, to bring you and, well, to bring the bride and the groom from the church to the house. And the warehouse, what about the warehouse? Was a more dignified or pretentious name for shop. Notices in the newspapers of wedding clothes on view were an advertising staple for early 19th century shopkeepers catering to exclusive clienteles. Much care was taken with the display of the finished clothes and also of the materials used in those that were still being made up. So the shops that would be making the wedding dresses, the clothes for a very special clientele would show off, so that everyone knows that they were responsible for the clothes of that specific powerful person. So they would display the clothes at the shop window, and anyone could go there to look at it. So Miss Grey's wedding clothes were on display, and they may be seen by everyone, and everyone would comment on how beautiful it was, how expensive it was, etc., etc. The calm and polite unconcern of Lady Middleton on the occasion was a happy relief to Eleanor's spirits, oppressed as they often were by the clamorous kindness of the others. It was a great comfort to her to be sure of exciting no interest in one person at least among their circle of friends. A great comfort to know that there was one who would meet her without feeling any curiosity after particulars, or any anxiety for her sister's health. Every qualification is raised at times by the circumstances of the moment to more than its real value, and she was sometimes worried down by officious condolence to rate good breeding as more indispensable to comfort than good nature. They were all good-natured, these people, but they were being they made Eleanor very uncomfortable. So in this specific situation, she thinks that good breeding is more indispensable to comfort than good nature. Lady Middleton expressed her sense of the affair about once every day, or twice if the subject occurred very often, by saying, "It is very shocking indeed." And by the means of this continual though gentle vent, was able not only to see the Miss Dashwoods from the first without the smallest emotion, but very soon to see them without recollecting a word of the matter. And having thus supported the dignity of her own sex, and spoken her decided censure of what was wrong in the other, she thought herself at liberty to attend to the interest of her own assemblies, and therefore determined, although rather against the opinion of Sir John, that as Mrs. Willoughby would at once be a woman of elegance and fortune, to leave her card with her as soon as she married. So Lady Middleton, she expresses her support by saying it is very shocking indeed, but after a while she thinks about herself again and she feels at liberty to throw her public assemblies, and because Mrs. Willoughby will be an important and elegant woman, to drop her card at her house when she's married to initiate a connection. But Sir John, of course, he censures that. Now, what is an assembly? That was very common, a very popular social activity in Regency England. It was an entertainment peculiar to the London season, the point of which was for a hostess to attract the largest number of fashionable guests that she could. As Simon's journal describes it, the people who give them the assemblies in their invitations only say that they will be at home such a day, and this some weeks beforehand. People are received at the door of the principal apartment by the mistress of the house standing, who smiles at every newcomer with a look of acquaintance. Nobody sits. There is no conversation, no cards, no music, only elbowing, turning, and winding from room to room, then at the end of a quarter of an hour, escaping to the hall door to wait for the carriage. So this was what an assembly consisted of, meaning to see and be seen, right? To be part of the society. So Lady Middleton wanted to carry on doing just that. Colonel Brandon's delicate, unobtrusive inquiries were never unwelcome to Miss Dashwood. He had abundantly earned the privilege of intimate discussion of her sister's disappointment by the friendly zeal with which he had endeavored to soften it, and they always conversed with confidence. His chief reward for the painful exertion of disclosing past sorrows and present humiliations was given in the pitying eye with which Marianne sometimes observed him, and the gentleness of her voice whenever, though it did not often happen, she was obliged or could oblige herself to speak to him. It didn't happen often, right? But she would speak to him, and she looks at him differently. So, based on what we know about Marianne, she's probably romanticizing his story, right? Is he the victim in a novel? Does she see him like that, like the sufferer in a sensibility novel? I'm sure her imagination is running wild with this kind of information about Colonel Brandon's past. These assured him that his exertion had produced an increase of goodwill towards himself, and this gave Elinor hopes of its being farther augmented hereafter. But Mrs. Jennings, who knew nothing of all this, who knew only that the colonel continued as grave as ever, and that she could neither prevail on him to make the offer himself, nor commission her to make it for him, began, at the end of 2 days, to think that instead of midsummer, they would not be married till Michaelmas, and by the end of a week that it would not be a match at all. The good understanding between the colonel and Miss Dashwood seemed rather to declare that the honours of the mulberry tree, the canal, and the yew arbour would all be made over to her, and Mrs. Jennings had for some time ceased to think at all of Mr. Ferrars. So, by observing Elinor and Colonel Brandon, Mrs. Jennings changes her mind and thinks that, you know what? Actually, Miss Elinor Dashwood would make a better match for Colonel Brandon than Marianne, and she soon forgets all about Edward Ferrars and thinks only of putting Colonel Brandon and Elinor Dashwood together. Now, what do you think about this possibility of Elinor and Colonel Brandon together? Let me know. Early in February, within a fortnight from the receipt of Willoughby's letter, Elinor had the painful office of informing her sister that he was married. She had taken care to have the intelligence conveyed to herself as soon as it was known that the ceremony was over, as she was desirous that Marianne should not receive the first notice of it from the public papers, which she saw her eagerly examining every morning. She received the news with resolute composure. Marianne is learning to exert herself. made no observation on it, and at first shed no tears. But after a short time they would burst out, and for the rest of the day she was in a state hardly less pitiable than when she first learned to expect the event. So she's still struggling, she's still learning to control her emotions, but they're still getting the better out of her. The Willoughbys left town as soon as they were married, and Eleanor now hoped, as there could be no danger of her seeing either of them, to prevail on her sister, who had never yet left the house since the blow first fell, to go out again by degrees, as she had done before. About this time, the two Miss Stills, oh, the Miss Stills are back, and the two Miss Stills lately arrived at their cousin's house in Bartlett's building, Holborn, presented themselves again before their more grand relations in Conduit and Berkeley Street, and were welcomed by them all with great cordiality. The address is very important, right? So the Miss Stills are staying in Holborn, and that's an unfashionable tradesman's area. And they are visiting their more grand relations in Conduit Street and Berkeley Street, the fashionable areas of London. So at that time, where you lived, where you were staying, your address meant a lot. Eleanor only was sorry to see them. Their presence always gave her pain, and she hardly knew how to make a very gracious return to the overpowering delight of Lucy in finding her still in town. "I should have been quite disappointed if I had not found you here still," said she repeatedly, with a strong emphasis on the word still. Because remember, Eleanor had told Lucy that she would be gone by February. So she would not have any chances to run into Edward Ferrars. But Lucy finds her there still, and she's so happy that she's there still. Of course, she's not a hypocrite, Lucy. "But I always thought I should. I was almost sure you would not leave London yet a while, though you told me, at Barton, that you should not stay above a month. But I thought at the time that you would most likely change your mind when you came to the point. It would have been such a great pity to have went away before your brother and sister came." Remember, she makes grammar mistakes because she did not have a formal education. "And now to be sure you will be in no hurry to be gone. I am amazingly glad you did not keep to your word." Look how acid Lucy is. Eleanor perfectly understood her, and was forced to use all her self-command to make it appear that she did not. "Well, my dear," said Mrs. Jennings, "and how did you travel?" "Not in the stage, I assure you," replied Miss Steele with quick exultation. "We came post all the way, and had a very smart boat to attend us. Dr. Davis was coming to town, and so we thought we'd join him in a post-chaise, and he behaved very genteelly and paid 10 or 12 shillings more than we did." So a stagecoach would be cheaper, right? Because it would be like public transportation. But they didn't come in a stage. They came post all the way. So they used a post coach, which meant that they paid for it, like private use for the carriage. "Oh, oh!" cried Mrs. Jennings. "Very pretty indeed. And the doctor is a single man, I warrant you." So her matchmaking skills are already on fire. "There now," said Miss Steele. Remember, Miss Steele is always the oldest, Miss plus the last name. Affectedly simpering. "Everybody laughs at me so about the doctor, and I cannot think why. My cousins say they are sure I have made a conquest, but for my part, I declare I never think about him from one hour's end to another. Lord, here comes your beau, Nancy," my cousin said the other day, when she saw him crossing the street to the house. "My beau, indeed," said I. "I cannot think who you mean. The doctor is no beau of mine." "Aye, aye, that is very pretty talking, but it won't do. The doctor is the man I see." "No, indeed," replied her cousin with affected earnestness, "and I beg you will contradict it if you ever hear it talked of." Mrs. Jennings directly gave her the gratifying assurance that she certainly would not contradict, and Miss Steele was made completely happy. "I suppose you will go stay with your brother and sister, Miss Dashwood, when they come to town," said Lucy, returning after a cessation of hostile hints to the charge. No, I do not think we shall. Oh, yes, I dare say you will. Eleanor would not humour her by farther opposition. What a charming thing it is that Mrs. Dashwood can spare you both for so long a time together. Lucy continues with her hints. Um, Long a time indeed, interposed Mrs. Jennings. Why, their visit is but just begun. Lucy was silenced. I'm sorry we cannot see your sister, Miss Dashwood, said Miss Steele. I'm sorry she's not well, for Marianne had left the room on their arrival. You are very good. My sister will be equally sorry to miss the pleasure of seeing you, but she has been very much plagued lately with nervous headaches, which make her unfit for company or conversation. Oh dear, that is a great pity, but such old friends as Lucy and me, I think she might see us, and I'm sure we would not speak a word. Old friends, they've known each other for what, 2 months or less? Oh no, longer because they stayed a long time in Barton, but still. Eleanor, with great civility, declined the proposal. Her sister was perhaps laid down upon the bed or in her dressing gown, and therefore not able to come to them. Oh, if that's all, cried Miss Steele, we can just as well go and see her. Eleanor began to find this impertinence too much for her temper, but she was saved the trouble of checking it by Lucy's sharp reprimand, which now, as on many occasions, though it did not give much sweetness to the manners of one sister, was of advantage in governing those of the other. And that is the end of chapter 10, or chapter 32. The Miss Steeles are back and they are terrible, right? Lucy only wants to attack Eleanor to find out more about her relationship with Edward. And Miss Steele, the oldest one, only talks about beaux and is very impertinent when she says that she could, as being such an old friend of Marianne, she could just barge into her room, even though she's in her pajamas, in her dressing gown. And so in her private space. Very good. So now let's take a look at chapter 33, which is the last chapter we'll talk about today. And in this chapter, we're going to see John Dashwood. So Marianne and Eleanor's stepbrother is back. Let's see how they interact with one another. After some opposition, Marianne yielded to her sister's entreaties and consented to go out with her and Mrs. Jennings one morning for half an hour. She expressly conditioned, however, for paying no visits and would do no more than accompany them to Grace in Sackville Street, where Eleanor was carrying on a negotiation for the exchange of a few old-fashioned jewels of her mother. Grace, Thomas Grace, was a very fashionable goldsmith and jeweler in Regency, England. So he had this address on Sackville Street. So a very fancy, fashionable place. When they stopped at the door, Mrs. Jennings recollected that there was a lady at the other end of the street on whom she ought to call. And as she had no business at Grace, it was resolved that while her young friends transacted theirs, she should pay her visit and return for them. On ascending the stairs, the Miss Dashwoods found so many people before them in the room that there was not a person at liberty to attend to their orders, and they were obliged to wait. All that could be done was to sit down at that end of the counter which seemed to promise the quickest succession. One gentleman only was standing there, and it is probable that Eleanor was not without hope of exciting his politeness to a quicker dispatch. But the correctness of his eye and the delicacy of his taste proved to be beyond his politeness. He was giving orders for a toothpick case for himself until its size, shape, and ornaments were determined, all of which, after examining and debating for a quarter of an hour over every toothpick case in the shop, were finally arranged by his own inventive fancy. He had no leisure to bestow any other attention on the two ladies than what was comprised in 3 or 4 very broad stares, a kind of notice which served to imprint on Eleanor the remembrance of a person and face of strong, natural, sterling insignificance, though adorned in the first style of fashion. So this man is taking a long time to decide on his toothpick case, and they are waiting, Eleanor and Marianne, and he stares at them, gives them 3 or 4 very broad stares. So he's quite impolite. Marianne was spared from the troublesome feelings of contempt and resentment on this impertinent examination of their features, and on the puppyism of his manner, which means impertinent affectation, like a dandy, of his manner in deciding on all the different horrors of the different toothpick cases presented to his inspection, by remaining unconscious of it all, for she was as well able to collect her thoughts within herself and be as ignorant of what was passing around her in Mr. Gray's shop as in her own bedroom. So Marianne was only physically there, she was not mentally there. At last the affair was decided. The ivory, the gold, and the pearls all received their appointment, and the gentleman having named the last day on which his existence could be continued without the possession of the toothpick case, the sarcastic narrator, drew on his gloves with leisurely care, and bestowing another glance on the Miss Dashwoods, but such a one as seemed rather to demand than express admiration, walked off with the happy air of real conceit and affected indifference. How dare him? Eleanor is probably thinking, right? Eleanor lost no time in bringing her business forward, and was on the point of concluding it when another gentleman presented himself at her side. She turned her eyes towards his face and found him with some surprise to be her brother. So their brother is there at this very expensive jeweler. Their affection and pleasure in meeting was just enough to make a very creditable appearance in Mr. Gray's shop. So just for appearances only. John Dashwood was really far from being sorry to see his sisters again. It rather gave them satisfaction, and his inquiries after their mother were respectful and attentive. Eleanor found that he and Fanny had been in town 2 days. "I wished very much to call upon you yesterday," said he, "but it was impossible, for we were obliged to take Harry to see the wild beasts at Exeter Exchange. We were obliged to take Harry there for this frivolous touristic activity instead of visiting family first." So you can tell where the John Dashwood's priorities are, right? Just a moment. And we spent the rest of the day with Mrs. Ferrars. Harry was very pleased. "This morning I had fully intended to call on you if I could possibly find a spare half hour, but one has always so much to do on first coming to town. I'm come here to bespeak Fanny a seal. Now a seal to seal her letters at Gray's." Thomas Gray's, the jeweler, was no cheap thing, right? And it shows that John Dashwood had money to spare, and that contrasts with the Miss Dashwood's financial situation. The Dashwood sisters had no money, whereas John, although he kept saying that he didn't have any, was spending it with trifles such as probably silver or even gold seal. "But tomorrow I think I shall certainly be able to call in Berkeley Street and be introduced to your friend, Mrs. Jennings. I understand she's a woman of very good fortune, and the Middletons too. You must introduce me to them. As my mother-in-law's relations, I shall be happy to show them every respect. They are excellent neighbors to you in the country, I understand." "Excellent indeed. Their attention to our comfort, their friendliness in every particular, is more than I can express." "I'm extremely glad to hear it, upon my word, extremely glad indeed. But so you ought to be. They are people of large fortune, they are related to you, and every civility and accommodation that can serve to make your situation pleasant might be reasonably expected." And what about him? He is their brother, stepbrother, but he is their brother. He has a large fortune, and he didn't help them at all. And now he says that it is the Middletons. It's expected, reasonably expected from the Middletons to treat them this way. And the Middletons are just far relations. What a hypocrite, huh? And so you are most comfortably settled in your little cottage and one for nothing. Edward brought us the most charming account of the place, the most complete thing of its kind, he said, that ever was. And you all seem to enjoy it beyond anything. It was a great satisfaction to us to hear it, I assure you. Your little cottage. Well, he lives in Norland Park. Eleanor did feel a little ashamed of her brother, and was not sorry to be spared the necessity of answering him by the arrival of Mrs. Jennings's servant, who came to tell her that his mistress waited for them at the door. Mr. Dashwood attended them downstairs, was introduced to Mrs. Jennings at the door of her carriage, and repeating his hope of being able to call on them the next day, took leave. His visit was duly paid. He came with a pretense at an apology from their sister-in-law for not coming to. So John Dashwood comes to visit them at Mrs. Dashwood's, but his wife doesn't come with him. But she was so much engaged with her mother that really she had no leisure for going anywhere. Mrs. Jennings, however, assured him directly that she should not stand upon ceremony, for they were all cousins or something like it, and she should certainly wait on Mrs. John Dashwood very soon, and bring her sisters to see her. His manners to them, though calm, were perfectly kind. To Mrs. Jennings, most attentively civil, and on Colonel Brandon's coming in soon after himself, he eyed him with a curiosity which seemed to say that he only wanted to know him to be rich, to be equally civil to him. So he treated each one according to their social rank. After staying with them half an hour, so that was actually a lot of time, 30 minutes. Normally, the minimum for a social visit was 15 minutes. So he was being extra polite. He asked Eleanor to walk with him to Conduit Street and introduce him to Sir John and Lady Middleton. The weather was remarkably fine, and she readily consented. As soon as they were out of the house, his inquiries began. Who is Colonel Brandon? Is he a man of fortune? Yes, he has very good property in Dorsetshire. I'm glad of it. He seems a most gentlemanlike man, and I think, Eleanor, I may congratulate you on the prospect of a very respectable establishment in life. Me, brother? What do you mean? He likes you. I observed him narrowly and am convinced of it. What is the amount of his fortune? I believe about 2,000 a year. 2,000 a year. And then, working himself up to a pitch of enthusiastic generosity, he added, Eleanor, I wish with all my heart it were twice as much for your sake. Indeed, I believe you, replied Eleanor, but I am very sure that Colonel Brandon has not the smallest wish of marrying me. You are mistaken, Eleanor. You are very much mistaken. A very little trouble on your side secures him. Perhaps just at present he may be undecided. The smallness of your fortune may make him hang back. His friends may all advise him against him. Her small fortune, he could help her with that. He could help her with providing her a dowry for marriage, but he doesn't. So he talks about Eleanor's life as if he had no responsibility or no consequence over it, right? As if he couldn't do anything about it. But some of those little attentions and encouragements which lady can so easily give will fix him in spite of himself. And there can be no reason why you should not try for him. It is not to be supposed that any prior attachment on your side. In short, you know, as to an attachment of that kind, it is quite out of the question. The objections are unsurmountable. You have too much sense not to see all that. Here, the unsurmountable objects, he's talking about Edward Ferrars. Colonel Brandon must be the man, and no civility shall be wanting on my part to make him pleased with you and your family. It is a match that must give universal satisfaction. In short, it is a kind of thing that, lowering his voice to an important whisper, will be exceedingly welcome to all parties. He didn't even ask how Eleanor felt about Colonel Brandon, but it will be a welcome match to all parties, except the wife and the groom. Recollecting himself, however, he added, That is, I mean to say, your friends are all truly anxious to see you settled. Well settled. Fanny, particularly, for she has your interests very much at heart, I assure you. And her mother, too, Mrs. Ferrars, a very good natured woman. I'm sure it would give her great pleasure. She said as much the other day. Because if Eleanor married Colonel Brandon, then it would mean that Edward Ferrars would be free of her. Eleanor would not vouchsafe any answer. It would be something remarkable now, he continued, something droll, if Fanny should have a brother and I a sister settling at the same time. And yet it is not very unlikely. What is he hinting at here? Is Mr. Edward Ferrars, said Eleanor with resolution, going to be married? It is not actually settled, but there is such a thing in agitation. He has a most excellent mother. Mrs. Ferrars, with the utmost liberality, will come forward and settle on him 1,000 a year if the match takes place. The lady is the Honourable Miss Morton, only daughter of the late Lord Morton, with £30,000. A very desirable connection on both sides, and I have not a doubt of its taking place in time. 1,000 a year is a great deal for a mother to give away, to make over forever, but Mrs. Ferrars has a noble spirit. To give you another instance of her liberality, the other day, as soon as we came to town, aware that money could not be very plenty with us just now, she put banknotes into Fanny's hands to the amount of £200, and extremely acceptable it is, for we must live at a great expense while we're here. He paused for her assent and compassion. And she forced herself to say, your expenses both in town and country must certainly be considerable, but your income is a large one. Not so large, I dare say, as many people suppose. I do not mean to complain, however. It is undoubtedly a comfortable one, and I hope will in time be better. The enclosure of Norland Common now carrying on is a most serious drain. And then I have made a little purchase within this half year, East Kingham Farm. You must remember the place where old Gibson used to live. The land was so very desirable for me in every respect, so immediately adjoining my own property, that I felt it my duty to buy it. I could not have answered it to my conscience to let it fall into any other hands. A man must pay for his convenience, and it has cost me a vast deal of money. So what John Dashwood is doing here is he's actually increasing the size of his property by buying adjoining farms. And he's complaining that he has no money. More than you think it really and intrinsically worth. Why, I hope not that. I might have sold it again the next day for more than I gave, but with regard to the purchase money, I might have been very unfortunate indeed, for the stocks were at that time so low that if I had not happened to have the necessary sum in bankers' hands, I must have sold out to very great loss. Eleanor could only smile. Other great and inevitable expenses, too, we have had on first coming to Norland. Our respected father, as you well know, bequeathed all the Stanhill effects that remained at Norland, and very valuable they were, to your mother. Far be it from me to repine at his doing so. He had an undoubted right to dispose of his own property as he chose. But in consequence of it, we have been obliged to make large purchases of linen, china, etc., to supply the place of what was taken away. You may guess after all these expenses how very far we must be from being rich, and how acceptable Mrs. Ferrars' kindness is. How dare he, right? How dare him say that? So remember that Eleanor's father could leave the girls barely nothing because of the law, but he left to their mom all the how do they call it? The effects, which means the linen, china, etc. So the silver plates, etc. to their mother. So their mother, Mrs. Dashwood, brought it all to Barton Cottage, and that left John and Fanny Dashwood with nothing. So they had to buy it all over again to replace what was taken. That's the word he used. Certainly, said Eleanor, and assisted by her liberality, I hope you may yet live to be in easy circumstances. Compare John Dashwood's circumstances with Eleanor's and Marianne's and Mrs. Dashwood's and Margaret's circumstances. Incredible. Another year or two may do much towards it, he gravely replied. But, however, there is still a great deal to be done. There is not a stone laid of Fanny's greenhouse, and nothing but the plan of the flower garden marked out. Where is the greenhouse to be? So they're renovating Norland Park. Upon the knoll behind the house. The old walnut trees are all come down to make room for it. It will be a very fine object from many parts of the park, and the flower garden will slope down just before it, and be exceedingly pretty. We have cleared away all the old thorns that grew in patches over the brow. Marianne would cry at all these changes, right? So John Dashwood and Fanny are modernizing Norland Park and removing all these picturesque characteristics that Marianne loved about Norland, changing it completely. Eleanor kept her concern and her censure to herself, and was very thankful that Marianne was not present to share the provocation. Having now said enough to make his poverty clear and to do away the necessity of buying a pair of earrings for each of his sisters, his next visit at Grace, his thoughts took a cheerfuller turn, and he began to congratulate Eleanor on having such a friend as Mrs. Jennings. Because John Dashwood was complaining of his poverty, so that Eleanor would not expect anything, would not expect him to buy anything for them at the jeweler's where they were, a pair of earrings or something. She seems a most valuable woman indeed. Her house, her style of living, all bespeak an exceeding good income, and it is an acquaintance that has not only been of great use to you hitherto, but in the end may prove materially advantageous, because he's thinking of Colonel Brandon. Her inviting you to town is certainly a vast thing in your favor, and indeed it speaks altogether so great a regard for you that in all probability when she dies you will not be forgotten. She must have a great deal to leave. And he, their brother, should be the one who had invited them to stay in London, not Mrs. Jennings. You see, he takes all responsibility out of himself. He washes his hands, right? Nothing at all, I should rather suppose, for she has only her jointure, which will descend to her children. But it is not to be imagined that she lives up to her income. Few people of common prudence will do that, and whatever she saves, she will be able to dispose of. And do you think it more likely that she should leave it to her daughters? And do you not think it more likely that she should leave it to her daughters than to us? Her daughters are both exceedingly well married, and therefore I cannot perceive the necessity of her remembering them farther. Whereas, in my opinion, by her taking so much notice of you and treating you in this kind of way, she has given you a sort of claim on her future consideration, which a conscientious woman would not disregard. Nothing can be kinder than her behavior, and she can hardly do all this without being aware of the expectations she raises. What about his expectations as a brother? But she raises none in those most concerned. Indeed, brother, your anxiety for our welfare and prosperity carries you too far. Why, to be sure, said he, seeming to recollect himself. People have very little in their power. But, my dear Eleanor, what is the matter with Marianne? She looks very unwell, has lost her color, and is grown quite thin. Is she ill? She is not so well. She has had a nervous complaint on her for several weeks. I'm sorry for that. At her time of life, anything of an illness destroys her bloom forever. Hers has been a very short one. She was as handsome a girl last September as any I ever saw, and as likely to attract the men. There was something in her style of beauty to please them particularly. I remember Fanny used to say that she would marry sooner and better than you did. Not but what she's exceedingly fond of you, but so it happened to strike her. She will be mistaken, however. I question whether Marianne now will marry a man worth more than 500 or 600 a year at the utmost, and I am very much deceived if you do not do better. Dorsetshire. I know very little of Dorsetshire, but my dear Eleanor, I shall be exceedingly glad to know more of it. And I think I can answer for your loving Fanny and for your having Fanny and myself among the earliest and best pleased of your visitors. So John Dashwood is treating Marianne and Eleanor as if they were objects for sale, that their appearance would determine how much they would get out of a marriage. So Marianne's been looking ill and thin, so she would not attract a very good marriage anymore, maximum 600 pounds, 600 pounds a year. But you, Marianne, you can do more because he's thinking about Colonel Brandon. You see how he sees the two girls as simply pawns in this social transaction, which was marriage at the time. Eleanor tried very seriously to convince him that there was no likelihood of her marrying Colonel Brandon, but it was an expectation of too much pleasure to himself to be relinquished, and he was really resolved on seeking an intimacy with that gentleman and promoting the marriage by every possible attention. He had just compunction enough for having done nothing for his sisters himself to be exceedingly anxious that everybody else should do a great deal, and an offer from Colonel Brandon or a legacy from Mrs. Jennings was the easiest means of atoning for his own neglect. That meant he didn't have to do anything, others would do it for him. They were lucky enough to find Lady Middleton at home, and Sir John came in before their visit ended. Abundance of civilities passed on all sides. Sir John was ready to like anybody, and though Mr. Dashwood did not seem to know much about horses, he soon set him down as a very good-natured fellow, while Lady Middleton saw enough of fashion in his appearance to think his acquaintance worth having, and Mr. Dashwood went away delighted with both. "I shall have a charming account to carry to Fanny," said he as he walked back with his sister. "Lady Middleton is really a most elegant woman, such a woman as I am sure Fanny will be glad to know. And Mrs. Jennings, too, an exceeding well-behaved woman, though not so elegant as her daughter. Your sister need not have any scruple even of visiting her, which, to say the truth, has been a little the case, and very naturally, for we only knew that Mrs. Jennings was the widow of a man who had got all his money in a low way, and Fanny and Mrs. Ferrars were both strongly prepossessed that neither she nor her daughters were such kind of women as Fanny would like to associate with. But now I can carry her a most satisfactory account of both." So that's the reason why Fanny Dashwood did not come to visit Mrs. Jennings, because she thought that she was not the kind of woman she would be content to associate with, because Mrs. Jennings was married to a man who had got his money in a low way, meaning business, trade, and not born rich, like we mentioned before. So that's the end of chapter 11, volume 2, or chapter 33. That's the last chapter we had to discuss today. I hope you enjoyed our discussion as we move, yes, towards the middle. As we are in the middle of the narrative now, the narrative gets thicker, so the chapters are a bit longer. So we go a bit over time, but I hope you've enjoyed the session anyway. Remember, you can always pause and return to the video or the audio whenever you want, and you can follow along with your own copy of Sense and Sensibility. Very good. So next time, and that will be Thursday, April 6th, we're going to talk about chapters 34 to 37. And remember, if you want to know more about the world of Jane Austen and her writing career, sign up for the online course, the Jane Austen Club, at booksandculture.club. And I'll see you next week. Bye.